So my name is Rittenbruch. I'm the Associate Director of the QUT Design Lab. I would like to welcome you to today's conversation seminar series. Start with acknowledgement of the traditional owners. The QUT acknowledges the Turrbal and Yagara people as the First Nations owners of the land where QUT now stands. We pay respect to the elders, laws, customs, and creation spirits. We recognize that these lands have always been places of teaching, research, and learning. QUT acknowledges the important role Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people play within the QUT community. So today I have the pleasure to introducing my colleague, Dr. Jen Seevinck, who is a senior lecturer in the interaction design and visual communication study areas. Her background is she builds computer-based interaction designs that draw on scientific and poetic interpretations of the world and studies audience experiences using qualitative methods with the aim of furthering our knowledge of experience design for emerging technologies and aesthetics. And Jane has been working in this space for a long time, including as a research scientist at the Virginia Modeling Analysis Center, where she did interaction design using state-of-the-art visualization technologies, including CAVE and AR across the medicine space and engineering. And I'm also in the unusual situation that I have to introduce myself as a speaker today because I'm one of the presenters. So my name is Rittenbruch. As I said, I've got a role in the design lab, but my background is also in interaction design. I've got a long history in working specifically around collaboration and collaborative systems. So I'm really interested in how people work together and collaborate. And for this presentation, we're specifically focused on extended reality and mixed reality and augmented reality. Okay, so the title of today's talk is Initial Insights into Design-Led Applications of AR and MR in Built Environment Contexts. And I'll come back to that, but it's, this is a project that has been seed funded by the faculty and has attracted a number of researchers from across the design lab. So what we're doing here is to really look at sort of some initial insights into the project that we've gained. Just briefly, the end of the year is rapidly approaching. So we only have one more seminar in the series. And the last seminar in the series is by the other peer-funded project, which is called Salutogenic Hospital Design. Actually, the project's called something different, but that's the topic, which I think our colleague, Marianella Kamara-Schock is going to present. And then next year, we're starting off again in January with a talk about resilient design and transformative learning. Okay, without further ado, I'm going to hand over to myself to get the other presentation started. All right, so as I said, this is a talk that's quite early on. So we have this project that's been funded by the faculty. And we wanted to specifically look at the use of augmented and mixed reality in built environment contexts. So that means industries including architecture, construction, engineering. And the reason for the focus on AR and MR is that we already know there are lots of applications and there's a very extensive use of virtual reality in these industries. But we wanted to look at sort of what role slightly newer technologies like mixed and augmented reality can play. And I'll come back to what we mean by that. So the name of the project is actually exploring the design-led applications of augmented and mixed reality. And the aim is to document best practice approaches. And basically the idea is to go and to speak to companies in this field to see what sort of technology they're already using, but more importantly, how they're applying that technology, which sort of problems they're trying to solve, which sort of problems are maybe they're not quite solving, they would like to solve. And the idea sort of to collate that information, A for documentation, but also then to, in the next step, to think through what could be future applications in this space. So it's really an exploration of a user-centered approach to look at how do these companies actually use these technologies. And there are a number of sort of literature studies that look at the use of these technologies across different industries. And we've done a literature analysis on that, but we think there's a lot of scope to actually better understand and document specific use cases of how this actually works and what it means for these companies. So this is the overall sort of official research aim. What is the potential of AR/MR technologies to create a competitive advantage for AEC industries to design, construct, evaluate, and predict the performance of the built environment? So, so that's a fairly large aim, but keep in mind this is a seed project. So what we're trying to do here is sort of get started on that. So I don't think we can definitively answer that, but we can gain some insights. And these are some of our research aims. So we have 4 aims. The first one is to identify and document the state of the art in the research gaps. And we've done that via literature analysis. The next one is to understand and highlight current innovative practices with regards to design and applications. So we're doing that through a series of interviews and then a series of design workshops. Next is to identify and assess opportunities and challenges. So that's about what could be possible. Again, we're running a design workshop and we're building a series of prototypes to address that. The prototype's actually number 4, to develop industry targeted prototypes and scenarios. So that's actually about how do we translate what we found into tangible outcomes. Quick timeline. So this is where we're at. So literature analysis started around January and completed around June. And then the interviews have now completed. It went from July to December. And we did have quite a sizable delay in recruiting interviewees and conducting the interviews due to COVID. Despite the fact that it's quite easy to get people on Zoom meetings, but sort of at the start of the year when we're recruiting, there was a lot of uncertainty around what companies are doing, where they're going, what the impact might be. So it was actually difficult then to sign up people. But I think sort of we're in a situation now where people are quite happy to talk to us and we were able to conduct the interviews. And then we're running a series of workshops early next year, January to March. Those are co-design workshops with industry to take what we've learned from the interviews and look at opportunities. And these then inform an iterative design process. So where we have a developer who will actually develop a number of prototypical applications based on the outcomes of the design workshop that we're trying to share with our industry partners and evaluate in situ if possible. So we would like to go into people's offices if we can, and then we'll basically disseminate the results towards October, November 2021. So that's a brief overview of the project. This is the research team. So I've got myself, Glenda, Veronica, Jen, Muge, Levi, Kirsty, Nick, Yesu, and Richard are all researchers in the QUT Design Lab. One thing that's defining as part of this project team is that we're quite multidisciplinary in the sense that from within design, we have a number of colleagues there. From architecture, it's really very important given the strong focus on the AEC industries. Then we've got a number of colleagues like Jen and myself and Kelly and Richard from interaction design. So I'm looking much more at the technology and the use of technology, and Levi from industrial design, also looking at how the technology is being built. And Muge is from interior design. So we've got a good range of sort of representation, sort of research and study areas there. And last but not least, we have Q Farm, who's not on the picture here, unfortunately, but didn't have a picture, but Q is our research officer on the project, who's been doing a lot of the work and helping to do the literature analysis and the interviews. So shout out to Q. Okay, so what I want to do, and what I and Jen want to do is run you through some of the initial sort of insights from the interviews. Before I do that, I just want to sort of delve into one or two other concepts. So I'm not going to give a long presentation about AR and MR and what it means in the industry, but I just want to sort of highlight a few things which I think are relevant. First, sort of around terminology, just basically what we mean by mixed reality. So this is the this is the reality-virtuality continuum that you might have seen. So it's one way of describing what we actually mean by virtual reality, augmented reality, mixed reality, etc. It's by Milgram, Takumara et al. And you can see here, basically, it sort of takes us all the way from the real environment to the left. So that's the real world without any sort of digital models involved, to the virtual environment on the right, which is a totally immersive 3D environment that has no natural elements, that's totally totally modeled. And then in between, we have sort of the opportunities to mix the virtual and the real environment. So augmented reality is probably the most well-known. It's where we superimpose 3D models into the real environment and allow people to interact with them. So that can be done via handheld devices like iPads, or via head-mounted devices, or via projection. So there's a number of ways of doing that. But the core element is sort of adding that virtual model to the real world. And then less common and less known is augmented virtuality. So that's not that is commonly discussed. That's the notion that you have a virtual environment, you bring in real world objects. So like people representing people via avatars, having video links into the real world, having sort of real world objects represented in the virtual environment. And then mixed reality is sort of often described as a combination of augmented and virtual reality. It can have elements of interaction, specifically sort of haptics and tangible interactions, so allowing people to actually not just see the environment, but interact with it either through controllers or custom-built interaction devices like VR treadmills, haptic suits, etc. So there's a lot of scope. There's also a lot of uncertainty and around what the term actually means. So Microsoft, for instance, uses mixed reality pretty much in the sense of how other people use sort of augmented reality. So it's not that well defined necessarily. And then last but not least, extended reality is something that we commonly use. It sort of really describes everything that is augmented and virtual in one common term. So anything to do with these sort of concepts is often described as extended reality. Okay, so I'll leave it there. The one thing I want to show, a very short video. The one thing that I think is relevant when we think about the potential of extended reality in the architecture, construction, and engineering industry is just the amazing capabilities that sort of have been arising over the last few years, and what that technology can deliver in these to these industries. So this is an architectural walkthrough. It's a little video. I'm just going to show you a couple of minutes of that. And this is just a 3D design that's been rendered using Unreal Engine. And just going to run through. So it's just a fly through. And as you can see here, one thing that the 3D modeling allows the people who create the video to do is to render textures, to render the light, the way the light flows through the building, etc. So you might have seen one of those or a similar one. But I think what it sort of showcases the power of VR, specifically in the context of architecture, to communicate ideas, and it's much different from a drawing or even a 3D model on a screen, sort of to showcase specific aspects and specific qualities of the building. So specifically, we think around textures, we think around modifying the lighting situation. And the other thing it allows us to do is to basically simulate. So it's very easy to change textures, to change lighting conditions, to add different light sources, etc. So it's a very powerful tool in that context. And so that's often used in the context of client walkthroughs, sort of showcasing specific design to clients. But it's also important in the sense that it can form part of a digital design pipeline. So it's sort of, we start with a 3D drawing and a 3D model and sort of end up with a client presentation. There's a real opportunity for cost saving to go from sort of a sort of mixed sort of pipeline that involves digital and analog to a fully digital design pipeline. And so this is sort of the potential of VR, and that's quite established in especially in architecture. The other thing I want to show is actually the application of augmented reality, which is less common. So this is an application of augmented reality. So this was collected, or this work done in the context of our design robotics project, which is a project within the QUT Design Lab. And this is showing Urban Arts Project, who are a company that creates art installations in New Farm, to how they use augmented reality in an assembly process. And I'll quickly play that.
Hello, my name is Luke Harris and I'm the cross-reality designer at UAP. The technology used for this job is an augmented reality or AR headset called the Microsoft HoloLens. Its role was to help me find the connection points for 450 rods across a 17-meter sculpture frame. The way it did this was to project a 3D virtual model of the artwork onto a real-world constructed frame similar to a hologram. Once I could see where these virtual rods were located, I marked and coded for drilling. Traditionally, we would measure and mark these points using a series of workshop drawings. So the advantage of the headset is we don't need to create these time-consuming documents. The headset does away with this process entirely. The ability to virtually see what you're making has huge benefits, and this technology will only get better and easier to use.
Okay. So that was a very short video, just showcasing the use of AR in a sort of construction process. And I think that's really interesting to sort of see how we go from something that happens in a studio where you sort of take clients there to actually take it onto a construction site or a building site. Okay, so next I'm going to briefly talk about our interviews. So we conducted, over a series of months, we conducted 10 interviews with 12 participants, part of this project. And the disciplinary breakdown is that we talked to colleagues from architecture firms, there were 5 participants, colleagues from engineering firms 3, 1 person from construction, and 3 people from related industries, which included companies that dealt with translating different models into different formats, a user experience company that deals with the use of AR, VR in a construction context, etc. And as I said, we're sort of fairly early on in the design process. So we have 5 people, sorry, who are coding the results at the moment. So we're in the middle of coding the results of the interviews. The interviews have been transcribed, and we're in the middle of a thematic analysis. But what we wanted to do is give you sort of some initial insights and some initial interesting ideas that we came across. So I'm just going to very briefly talk about two aspects. The first one is adoption. So the questions of how does technology, once it sort of appears in the company, actually get spread across the company. And the first thing that we noticed is sort of how much more common VR is as opposed to augmented reality. So when we started the project, we had this idea that augmented reality is something that's quite established technically, and that we would find sort of quite commonly. But the reality is that the majority of work that's done in this context is still very much around VR and very much around sort of design reviews and client walkthroughs. So that's the bulk of the work, and that's quite established. So the majority of companies that we talk to do this in one form or another. And so the adoption process is anything from sort of companies who sort of have dedicated studio setups to companies that have a more flexible approach. And with regards to VR, we actually saw sort of a number of interesting approaches. So it's less common, and some companies have sort of tried it and sort of found it's not quite suitable for them. But there's a specific approach that some companies use, which is to look at, small innovative projects. So companies have come up with ideas for instance, overlaying construction drawings onto a building site. And often it's sort of driven by efforts of individual people who are interested to say, I'm going to make this a project. And then with this initial sort of showcase of how this could be done, that creates momentum for other people to have an interest in this technology. So often it's sort of something that's driven by incremental adoption in a way. So I think that's an interesting aspect there. The other one was sort of what we've seen was just the changes of technology over time. So extended reality and specifically virtual reality has been around for quite a time. So, but we're seeing that companies sort of adopting sort of to new opportunities. So things like haptic feedback, for instance, is not very common, or treadmills. But, again, through sort of incremental adoption, we're seeing people experimenting with new aspects. So there was one company for specifically that now thinks they've solved pretty much how they use VR, but they're really interested in haptic feedback and see that as the next frontier. So that's something that is that's happening that relates to adoption. We think that's interesting. The other aspect I want to talk about briefly is the organizational setup, and that's quite related, and that relates to how companies organize the AR and VR work that they do. And we saw quite a number of differences there. So on the one hand, you have companies that have created dedicated in-house teams, sometimes even dedicated companies that specifically deal with sort of any AR, VR needs. So they're basically the clearinghouse and the team that deals with everything. So if somebody has an issue, they have a 3D model that needs to be translated into a client walkthrough, then they contact those colleagues within those sort of specific groups. Other companies have bought external expertise into the company. So they bought, say, studios that specifically deal with AR and VR. And those teams often sort of have a different agenda and often set sort of the agenda for the company when it comes to sort of bringing innovation and bringing in different use cases, for instance, for this technology. And then there are companies that actually have AR and VR distributed across their whole organization. So each studio and each different part of the company that is, say, in a different city has their own AR and VR team. And last but not least, there are also companies that have organizational specializations, like teams that deal with the design of stadiums, for instance. And within that, they have dedicated teams that then apply VR in this context. And they're quite diverse applications. So if we're looking at stadium design, that's often not just visualizing a stadium, that's also dealing with the flow of people through the stadium, how you can simulate that. And if you think about, say, the design of a hospital, again, VR is often used to actually not just sort of showcase a room, but actually simulate a room. So I work with medical professionals to look at how could this room be designed, how could we sort of make it more efficient, etc. So these are some of the things that we've seen in terms of organizational setup, and we're sort of trying to draw that out a bit more. So those are just some initial insight, and I might leave that here and pass over to my colleague Jen.
All right. So yeah, so one of the things that we found that was coming out of this was user experience. We've done a few passes of coding, and so an initial set of codes. I'm going to talk a little bit about the coding process as well, because I'm actually going to show you some data that led to this idea, this emerging theme of user experience. So we started off looking at curating human experiences, and so that was, for example, in participant 6, here's an example. So not being able to navigate is what this participant said. At the initial stages of not being able to navigate through the whole model, but sort of controlling the environment. Or we've offered them to wear the headset and they've preferred to just watch it on the screen and have somebody else control and have somebody else wear the headset. So, there's, as starting to look at the quality of the experience of of interaction with the technology. And part of that as well in the initial thinking and initial coding was to identify things around usability. So that's generally one user at a time, everyone else is watching the screen, and the smoothness of that experience. So a participant commenting on some of these aesthetic and affective and emotional aspects, like freaking out and they want to take it off. So I think, you know, guiding someone through the experience is always best, because inherently the person driving it knows where they're going. So these were some of the things that we're finding in the data that started to suggest there's a bit more to this than just usability or curating the experience, that there are these emotional and possibly even health risks involved in this. And so that, you know, for coders coming in with an interaction design background like myself, I was then really drawing on user experience. And so what is user experience? So I just did a really quick tag cloud of, I think, the Wikipedia definition, but you can see here, it's a user experience, a UX is subjective. It's about somebody's perception and their attitude. So that can be an anticipation of their experience of a product or a service or a system. It's also within their interaction with that service. So it's dependent on context. It's something that's changing all the time. It's time-based, it's dynamic. Emotions play a role here. So does efficiency and ease of use. So usability, definitely the functionality of it, and those practical applications and areas, and that are key to this, but so is that it's meaningful to someone. So coming back from that then and looking at, you know, starting with a lot of our codes, and then as we did more codes and more interviews, we moved beyond these usability and curatorial kind of perspectives to look at, you know, let's just see what about user experience. So these were some of our other codes. These words that I've got written on the screen here are some of the codes that we've come up with, and they're starting to inform this theme of user experience. So that there's that discomfort of having somebody else, you know, you're in a virtual reality environment, you bend over and you're so lost in it, but then all of a sudden you hear somebody snicker in the background. So you feel uncomfortable. So that's one of those health aspects as well. User-centered design. So who is the user? Who are we designing for? How do we design to take all those different facets into account? And people are actually talking about those things, starting to in these interviews. Where is the opportunity? Is it within the client, within the team? Is it internal, or is it facing the client? Emotions, a sense of being lost in the environment and convinced that it's real, versus precision and accuracy. And functionality, is it doing its job? So these are all very broad aspects. It's a really big thing. User experience is a huge field, but what we're looking at it is in the context of the AEC industry. So that's really how we're limiting it, is within the context of what we're seeing with these interviews. So I'm going to talk about a couple of these that I just identified there, those aspects of user experience, safety, who is the user, and also user-centered testing. So safety of the user, I'm already just described as a snicker from someone, so that you don't want to be embarrassed. Through to the field of view, and that you might actually trip over something. The problem with augmented reality is field of view issues, really. I know we can take an iPad or a phone and we can hold it up and kind of see what's going on, but you're focused on the target, you're not noticing the whole. It's just down over the here, which you would normally see with your peripheral vision and go, danger, danger, something's there, but then you might stumble and fall. So there's those sorts of safety issues there. But then interestingly, there's also the application areas. So where UX and these systems can work to facilitate safety in the field. So I'm jumping across a bit to some of the use cases that we have identified, which I won't cover any more other than to say here that the safety of some of the team members as well, and that some of these tools will change the way that we work, so that you can sort of have cautionary hints about high-risk work and facilitate safety in people in high-risk situations. All right, so the second one that I was going to talk about is this notion of who is the user. And we saw a diverse range of users across different disciplines. So we saw the clients, the engineering managers, the design teams, things that we would have expected, the salespeople for visualization. But we also saw people on the construction side checking things. This was more of an anticipated use that were discussed. So I don't think that we saw anybody doing this yet, but that they would actually be designing for a construction site, for the person who's working on the construction site to actually check things. And also emergency response assessment. So for someone to come in and to check whether or not the exits and the emergency response gear is in the right places and are adequately positioned. So one thing that I don't think we expected to find out was that they're also using these technology systems for final end users of the architectural designs. So your cleaners, to check whether a vacuum cleaner will fit in the space. That they could anticipate this, but they also actually did some of this. So doctors, that they anticipated that if you're designing a hospital, and Marcus was alluding to this before, if you're designing a hospital, then you would bring in your doctors and your nurses or some of your specialists to talk about whether or not this was going to suit their purposes. Through to the train station users, is the wayfinding working? And that was, you know, a great use case scenario that we identified there. So the last one that I want to talk about, which I found really exciting, was this notion of user-centered testing. And we had participant 12 here talk about this, and so they could walk through those existing tram stops with someone and stopping at points and asking them, how do you feel? How could we improve this? What would be your, you know, how would you feel if we moved the tram stop here and here? So describing the scenario where in virtual reality, they had people who would be the tram stop users actually going through that and giving feedback on the design and the layout in terms of how they would use it. And that they are actually using virtual reality for that customer testing. And what's useful here is, I'll just, one of the cool stories, cool kind of stories is it's a small thing, but we found it interesting. And this led to a cost benefit immediate, was that we had the client there. He was walking through the virtual airport and he noticed the balustrade wasn't like, it was a glass balustrade, was quite low, and he actually took his headset off and he rang the fabricator and he said, like, stop cutting the glass, we need to make it higher. So the client was able to see that in the virtual reality environment right then. They were actually testing for wayfinding at the time, or showing him the wayfinding design. But he noticed this about the balustrade. So an unexpected output, and a small thing, says this participant, but it's a lot of money being spent on glass, and our model was quite cheap. It offset the cost of that model immediately. So this user-centered testing is really showing a lot of promise, it would seem. And what is very exciting about this was that some of the companies were actually created user experience design teams for doing these user studies with those stakeholders. So bringing, and for designing the user experience for the end customer as well. So that the user experience designer becomes a part of this, of the AEC industry potentially. All right, well, that's that. This is, yeah, so we've been, Marcus has shown you our initial post-its, and we're in the process now of reorganizing these and zooming in on possible themes. So that's in F104, if anyone's interested.
Thanks, Jen. I might just show one last slide before we go to the discussion. I just wanted to briefly sort of tie in the work on this project with the work that we're doing in the Design Lab. So I think there's a lot of potential here for Design Lab research more general. So I think this is a good example for work that's happening in the Future Technologies and Design Lab, sort of in the Emerging Technologies program. But I think there are benefits from what we're seeing here, specifically in the AEC industry, also around our work in design robotics and in health. So we're thinking about salutogenic hospital design, for instance. You could think about sort of what is the overlap, or what could potential applications for VR in this space be. And there are already lots of health applications of extended reality in health, but specifically sort of the cross-fertilization sort of coming from this project and looking at sort of how, for instance, hospitals are designed in the AEC industries and translating that into sort of a health-specific perspective. And there's also lots of opportunity for cross-faculty collaboration, specifically sort of around engineering and creative industries. And the last thing I want to mention is that this project has brought a little bit of equipment, including HoloLens 2, and the Design Lab is setting up a sort of optimistically named extended reality studio, where we sort of have some of this equipment available, and it's going to be fairly small scale. And I'll be talking about that on Friday. So if you are interested, come along to that discussion. We will want to look at how can we enable our own researchers to use some of this equipment. Okay, so that's the tie-in, and I'll open up for discussion. Who has a question? This is the limitation if the host is also one of the presenters, because normally I would come in and ask the first question, but it's a little bit difficult. So I might have to rely on you. So maybe some of the people, I can see some people who are actually on the project with us. Does anybody want to go
I can ask a question. Jen was asking about these case studies that we have identified. So what was the idea with the case studies? I didn't know about that, and I didn't understand that bit. I probably would like to hear more about it.
Yeah, we identified loads of case studies, but we just we could only talk about so much in this session. So we sort of I constrained it to user experience. But yeah, do you want to mention?
Yeah. It's the idea of like following that up, or it's just some examples of things that are happening with the data that we collected.
So that's out of the interviews. Those are documentations of specific applications where the technology was used. So concrete examples, for instance, you know, overlaying.
Yes, so some of the scenarios, like using it for wayfinding, using it for business. Intelligent
hospital design,
building, BIM. Yeah, so, and the MCG, was it? I think that they overlaid the stadium with temperature flow and other data, so augmenting it with simulation data, that those are scenarios as well, as you know, what it's like for the person to move through it in terms of their experience with the wayfinding, for example. So a whole range.
Yeah, and who were the ones talking about hospital design, just out of like curiosity?
So we probably shouldn't mention individual companies here.
Yeah, okay.
In the context, in terms of ethical context, but yeah, I think it's actually not that was a specific use case, but I think that came up a number of times, and the core point there was sort of the ability to save costs through simulation. So that's something that would have been done via an actual model, or through an actual, not just an actual model, but an actual room that was being set up and built as an example for people to experiment. So doing that in VR and being able to make modifications was a massive cost saving for that company.
Yeah, okay, great.
Thanks, Veronica.
Thank you.
Thank you.
There you go. Hilda's sending a question through on the chat. Maybe a silly question, but who set up the tech for you? Did you do it yourself or collaborate with computer scientists, or are you programming yourself? If this makes sense. Thanks, Hilda. So at this stage, we haven't set up any tech. We bought the HoloLens 2 and we've sort of set it up, but we haven't really developed with it. So this is we're the stage of interviews. So it's all just talking to our participants to gain the insights. And for the third phase of the project, so following the design workshops, we will hire a developer who can develop using sort of augmented reality approaches. And that's work that we're doing in collaboration with that developer. So that's really just to develop some prototypes, some ideas that we have that come out of the design workshop, where we think we can sort of showcase specific types of applications. Does that answer your question? Okay, thanks. Yes, good.
Okay, well, thanks for the presentation. Like as always, I enjoy watching like what you're doing, guys. And just a small comment on like I really loved this theme emerged from the interview from participants, which you called curating human experiences, which I believe can be given in a more wider context. I understand that this project is specifically generated around architecture and built environments, but this is something that really catched my attention. So would love to learn something about that. And also in relation to augmented virtuality, this is like really interesting growing space. And yeah, I'm sure that there will be huge success of your project, like employing and exploring this particular area. And from here, I'm just wondering, like I understand it's just the very beginning of the project, but I assume that you will be, you know, writing a lot of papers and stuff. So where I can probably, you know, keep an eye on just to follow up the progress of the project, just to maybe get a list of, you know, literature you're doing and so on. Yeah. So you have the website for the project, just to kind of like follow up touch points.
Yeah, thanks, Anastasia. So, so no, we don't have a website at the moment, but we're sort of, we should be represented to the Design Lab website. So we do have a presence there, but as I said, we're sort of just doing the first bit of analysis. So hopefully we'll put some information up there. But, you know, if you're interested, also just come in and talk to us, and, you know, to some of the researchers on the team that you know, or come along to a meeting and just have a chat with us. I mean, you know, we are a project within the Design Lab, so we're not particularly secret. We're very happy to talk to everybody, and for people to come and chat to us. And so the first aspect you mentioned, the curated user experience, it was a really interesting point, and Jen talked about that a little bit. So one aspect there, I think that's interesting, is that sort of integration, sort of where you, on the one hand, you have sort of in the past 3D models and sort of the visualization of the 3D models wasn't necessarily fully integrated. So you would create a 3D model in say Rhino or Grasshopper, but that wasn't something that you could sort of immediately view in a VR sort of context. And that integration is progressing now, but, you know, there's still work to be done to actually make it really fine-tuned and sort of really look at, does it require sort of high quality rendering, say in a game engine? How does it work from a user experience point of view? Does it actually support a full walkthrough? Do people know where they're going? Onto sort of things like onboarding, you know, how to actually explain to people how to use the headset so they don't get sick. You know, there's a whole bunch of aspects around that we found were really interesting, where the industry is really sort of becoming much more mature in using that, not as a novelty, but as a day-to-day tool. Jen, was there another aspect?
Yeah, that's right. So, I mean, that it's not just about being able to, for example, navigate or that user experience is a broader umbrella that can capture that as a field that that takes into account and questions and provides frameworks and methods for interrogating the different aspects of designing for people's experience and of their experience. So not just curating it and setting it up, but also, I guess anticipating what they might not want to do, or what you might not think they want to do. measuring it, testing for it?
Not before, but it's something you guys thinking.
So affective and perceptual and ease of use, just identifying those things specifically. I don't know who that is that's talking to us, so sorry. That wasn't me. Yeah, so just, you know, going across from function through to subjective and affective experiences, that whole gamut, and taking each of them into consideration.
Yeah, well, yeah, thank you. Yeah, I really need to probably come and talk to you, and because like what I've seen, like beyond that, like term is where like there also could be some, you know, views of media architecture with design and experiences, such as creating experiences like, you know, nostalgic memories, reconstruction with AR and so on. So they like completely like big other things that can be just like given in the different context, but again surrounded by this curating slash designing human experiences, not like where humans, they are not only, I mean, they're users in a sense, but they also co-creators and co-designers of those experiences. Yeah, so like sounds absolutely interesting. Well, yeah, thank you. Really love to learn from you.
Yeah, I wholeheartedly agree about participation versus user. And I guess that's also like curation can be a bit of a focused top-down approach. What if people want to self-curate? But anyway, yes, we should talk some more. I know you've been working in AR as well, Anastasia, in your units, which I don't know if many people are aware of that, but there's some beautiful work coming out of AR and VisCom, coming out of VisCom and AR with Anastasia's work.
Yeah, well, thank you. Thanks.
So, Anastasia, do we have any other questions?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yeah, Anthony, hi.
Hi, Jennifer and Marcus. Really good presentation, really insightful. Just wanted to ask, so when you're looking at the different companies you approached, did you find there was a great deal of disparity between their adoption readiness in applying these technologies? Or were they all on similar levels, do you think? I don't know if you covered.
I might answer that. So yeah, absolutely yes. And I mean, that's also because the diversity of companies that we spoke to is quite large. I mean, not only did we speak to different sized companies, we also spoke to companies across quite different industries. I mean, you know, even though it was all within the AEC context, there's quite a difference between sort of an architecture firm and a construction business and an engineering firm, right? Both in terms of sort of business, the type of business that they conduct, but also in terms of size. But I mean, that was also the purpose. We're not trying to sort of homogenize to find the most common applications of XR. We're actually very interested in the individual sort of applications, but also in the intersections between the industries. And that probably didn't come out as well. There are quite a few really interesting sort of handovers where the architects hand over a model to, say, an engineer or a builder, and how does that actually work? What role does not just digital models, but you know, VR and AR and MR in the context of digital models play to facilitate that handover to go from sort of something that's being designed to being constructed, and also does it open possibilities for iterative processes? Normally, you know, architects provide a sketch that gets handed over to the builder, and that's sort of the end of that. But sort of to what extent is there actually a back and forth where the model allows for more flexibility for changes still to be made?
More like a DFMA.
So it's you know, it's tied in with the digital model, but I think sort of that inspection of the digital model through VR and then through IR in a more context specific manner, where you go on site and look at things on site, which is a challenge. It's not very common, but it's something people try to do. So yeah, I don't know whether that answers your question.
Yeah, no, it was interesting. Thank you. Okay,
doesn't sound like it. So all right, so please join me in thanking Jen and myself for this presentation, and thank you very much for coming. So I'll see you at the next conversation seminar in December. Thanks for joining. All right. Goodbye.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye.